So what I want to do is to shift gears, I guess, a little bit and sort of focus on the fact that within social movements, within many social struggles, there's a lot of intellectual work that takes place that is either implicit within those social struggles and learning that takes place within those social struggles and research that takes place in those social struggles, but is not always recognised as being research or intellectual work. And I think as somebody who's come out of now, and I kind of get scared when I say this, about 25 years of activism in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and since I've been here in North America too, it's kind of I think something that when I came to university later in life and started reading social movement theory and reading a lot of this stuff, I found a huge disconnect in reading about social movements that looked at social movements and social struggles, about whether they were successful or not. Chris and Doug Bevington wrote a really good article some years ago about movement relevant research, which was one of those times when I started doing my academic work. I thought, oh wow, somebody's actually writing about this in a way that I can relate to as someone who's come out of activist background without formal education in a tertiary institution until quite recently. And I think that's a really important point, is actually to focus on, and that's now I'm an academic at McGill. One of the things that I look at a lot is around this issue of knowledge production and the politics of knowledge production within social movements. And I think there is also really, I think the work that's been done in terms of trying to theorise and talk about different methodologies and the ways and the tensions between kind of quote-unquote academic research and activism is really important and interesting. But what I don't find in a lot of the academic work that's come out, including some of the stuff that's been done by people who are engaged in different struggles, is actually trying to articulate actually existing research practices within different activist milieu. And that's what I'm really interested in thinking about and talking about, because we talk about sometimes research as if it's this, it gets very mystified, right? There's sort of those that do research and those that, remember back in, the sort of the days of the anti-globalisation sort of heyday, a friend of mine talked about the separation between the brain and the brawn of the movement. There was this idea that there were these people who would go round on this sort of the counter summit circuit, we used to call it, or the NGO Olympics, who were often university educated profs or professionalised NGO people who would be the experts, and they would say, yeah, we don't like APEC or the WTO, and here's what we've got to do. Meanwhile, peasant farmers, indigenous activists, other people who were often, migrant workers on the front lines of struggle, were sort of constructed in a way that actually bled the fact that within their struggles there was theorising, there was knowledge production, and there was research. But there's this whole question, right, of what is research and where is research and what we recognise. Now, Linda Smith, who's a Māori academic from Aotearoa, New Zealand, talked about this in her book Decolonising Methodologies, that many Indigenous young folks in Aotearoa, who maybe have done a degree or maybe whatever, have gone back to working in their communities doing quote-unquote research, but because it's happening in a different sort of milieu, it's not kind of seen as being research. And because they can't necessarily articulate a methodological approach, even though it may well, there is an implicit one or theoretical approach, this is seen as not being kind of research. And I think it's interesting thinking about some of the issues that Chris started up with around, thinking about the politics of citation in universities. Because what I find is really interesting is somebody who came to university after finding myself and groups that I've been involved with quoted in academic journal articles, but not being seen as being, like I used to go to universities and I'd be like the token activist that a prof would bring in, and they'd be like, okay, we've got like somebody who's involved with stuff, and I'd do a sort of like a little performance and then we get on with the real stuff, the theorising and so on. One time I did a class and somebody, it's like, do you consider yourself to be, what's that thing about a transnational cosmopolitan or something that Tarot has, one of these sort of social, rooted cosmopolitan. Like, I don't know, does it matter? How is this useful? How is this analytically useful to thinking about social movements and so on? So in thinking about this and in sort of just, I guess, I want to throw out a few sort of questions that I guess are also a little bit around coming out of some suspicion. I think there are some really important lessons to be learnt from things like participatory action research, and I know Gary's book, the work in terms of institutional ethnography, political activist ethnography, I think are really important, have some really important insights. But I think it's really important to be also sort of like questioning whether a methodological approach per se means that means that your kind of research is going to be okay for, it's going to be cool and activisty in there. And I think what's really important is this issue about relationships, right, and engagement, because I'm putting a chapter together for a book which will be coming out with PM Press next year called Organising. That's the commercial break. With Devlin Kuyek, who's a friend who does a lot of research with GRAIN. Both of us, GRAIN is an NGO that does research around biodiversity, farmers' rights, etc., etc. And we've talked over the years about how it is we do what we do, because even though I'm an academic and I do publish stuff in peer-reviewed journals that probably 6 or 7 people will read, and I also do various other kinds of things. I also continue to do other kinds of work. I mean, that's my paid job, but just because I'm sure many of us here have our paid jobs, and we also do other kinds of research. And so we were talking about this, how first of all, a lot of us who are activist researchers don't actually get to think through and explicitly talk among ourselves about how it is we know what we know, how it is we do what we do, what are the mechanisms of accountability. And I really relate to what Chris was saying about these kind of different ways of being accountable to folks, whether it's having that kind of double layer of the academic stuff if you're doing something for an academic publication, but always checking stuff out with people. And one of the things I think that we were talking about a lot was about this issue about how we get the research right, because I don't want to romanticise all knowledge production in activist circles as being kind of great, but there is a lot of really good activist research out there. I think about work that's being done on transnational corporations. I tend to look for stuff that's being done by activists rather than, unfortunately, with some exceptions, stuff that's come out of academic institutions for the most part. There are some really good sorts of researches that are happening there. And I think, and this is something Chris touched upon in that article that you co-wrote a few years ago, was around notions about rigour, right? And this idea about what is rigour, intellectual rigour, and so on. Is it peer review? Is it this? But if you're actually researching for a campaign that you're about to go public with, you're going up against whatever, a corporation or a state or a security intelligence agency or whatever. There are certain pressures on you to actually get the information right before you go public, which is a different kind of pressure from getting it right to have a double-blind peer-reviewed article in a journal, which may well be very interesting, but may well not get out there very much. And I think also if you have a network of relationships that's built up on trust, that's built up, some of these are formal and informal relationships, which include things like an ongoing process of actually sharing, checking out facts, dissemination, collection, discussions about when, how and whether and in what form you kind of release the research, and an understanding that research isn't sort of necessarily like a one-stop or a one-hit kind of thing. You put the article out, or you put the